Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. Have you ever woken up to a crisis because a number on a dashboard is broken and no one knows why, or sent out frustrating Slack messages trying to find the right dataset, or tried to understand what a column name means? Our friends at Atlan started out as a data team themselves and faced all this collaboration chaos. They started building Atlan as an internal tool for themselves. Atlan is a collaborative workspace for data-driven teams, like GitHub for engineering or Figma for design teams. By acting as a virtual hub for data assets ranging from tables and dashboards to SQL snippets and code, Atlan enables teams to create a single source of truth for all of their data assets, and collaborate across the modern data stack through deep integrations with tools like Snowflake, Slack, Looker, and more. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Atlan today, that's ATLAN, and sign up for a free trial. If you're a Data Engineering Podcast listener, you get credits worth $3,000 on an annual subscription. When you're ready to build your next pipeline and want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows, or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today, that's LINODE, and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Boris Jabes about Census and the growing category of operational analytics. So, Boris, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me. So I'm the CEO over at Census, where we've been building what people call a reverse ETL for the last few years. We were founded in 2018. I'm a lifelong kind of tool builder. Before this, I ran a company that actually help people manage passwords and kind of deal with employee identity. And before that, I worked on Visual Studio, godfather of programming tools.
And do you remember how you first got involved in data management?
Yeah. So in 2017 and 2018, there's a couple things that were both kind of happening to me or to my team and that we were kind of working with people on. We were kind of always obsessed with customer data in some form or another. And I think the earliest kind of signal or experience we had that caused us to build Census was actually a few years back. I sold my last company and started working across Boston and San Francisco at the time and collaborating with, sales and marketing people that were not of my team, right? It's a very standard thing that happens in an acquisition. And it wasn't going that well. And I did the classic thing at the time, which is to just blame the culture and the people, because that's easy. And the truth is, we were a product-led startup. We were very self-serve software. We had an operator console and all these things sitting in San Francisco. I could train everyone on my team to be able to look stuff up. And the truth was that, these other sales and marketing folks didn't have access to that. And so they didn't know how to message our customers. They didn't know how to do, useful reach out based on what they were doing. And so that's actually where the background thread for Census began, which was maybe the issue is not just cultural, but it's actually a connection problem between product and let's call it analytics teams versus sales, marketing, and support teams, and how they live in different tools and maybe there's something there that's missing. And so that's let's call that the germ of the truth of Census, right? That's where it kind of began. And then as I started digging into this, it really just hit a weird part of my brain that is completely obsessed with what I'll call certain kinds of data federation problems. So my first company and Census are both actually solving a very similar problem, which is that in the world of SaaS, in the world of having now expanded into the internet and everyone's using software as a service for the last 10 plus years, right? We now have just an explosion of software as a service inside a company. I think one of our customers has over 300 apps that they use, right? Independent web apps. That there's all these things that will occur because of that are chaotic and actually make things worse. So one is, security and logging in and employee identity. That was my first company. And then customer data is just kind of replicated independently in all these products. And so, whereas in my brain went to this necessary better design, which is that like we need this centralized and federated somehow, because you really can't have a plethora of tools dealing with the same nouns and schemas, but yet having them rebuilt from scratch independently and then wired together kind of ad hoc. And so that's how Census was born. And that's why we named the product Census, right? To solve that problem. So that was about 2017, 2018.
And so for people who aren't familiar with Census, I'm wondering if you can just give a bit more of a detail on what it is that you're building there. And you've already given some of the story behind how it came about, but maybe where it sits in this overall sort of nascent space of operational analytics versus reverse ETL.
So Census at its simplest is a tool that connects to a data warehouse, a cloud data warehouse, and allows you to extract models, insights, metrics that you have in your warehouse and sync them seamlessly into tools that people use to actually do their work every day. So Salesforce, Marketo, Zendesk, et cetera. So this is, kind of going beyond what people do in a BI tool where you're looking at data and you have really amazing charts, and actually pushing data directly into systems of action, whether that's a salesperson or a marketer or a support person, are actually doing their work every day in their pane of glass, right? So that's what Census does. And this is what people colloquially like now call reverse ETL as a tool. You can think of that as like how that works is about connecting to a warehouse and like moving data seamlessly out, right? So that's why this term reverse ETL emerged. I don't like to obsess about like the fact that it's kind of a misnomer since ETL has no direction, but that's roughly the kind of reverse ETL means. It's the tool, the process by which you get data from a warehouse seamlessly, efficiently, incrementally out to destinations that are, tools that people use to do their work. Now, operational analytics is like, you could think of that as like what that enables, with the methodology that comes out of using a tool like this, which is the idea that analytics is actually at the center of all your operations rather than two independent entities in a company. That's actually what's important here about what we do. It's less moving the bits around, actually, and much more about helping data teams position themselves kind of at the center of their company and specifically at the center of all these kind of functional workflows that are driving the business. That's kind of what I think of as like my life mission or the company's life mission, which is to say, instead of a data team being this quarterly, like retroactive look back at, how much revenue did we make? Instead, they should be drivers of, how do we increase revenue, or how do we improve our support, or how do we better reach our new customers, right, et cetera. And data teams are the only team pretty much in the company, right, that have access to all the information that's happening, like from inside and outside, right? And so they're actually uniquely suited to being the broker to enable all this. Generally I find it frustrating to watch our users or prospective users be stuck kind of just dealing with the request of the week, request of the day, please fix this chart, please make me another chart. And I think they have just a lot more to offer because they can think in terms of what are interesting KPIs. They can invent new KPIs and then push them out to the rest of the organization, and not just pushing them through a picture that people look at in a board meeting, but actually push them directly all the way into the, the pane of glass that every single person sits in the company.
Yeah, and one of the recent trends, maybe within the past 5 years in business intelligence, is that there's been the recognition that just seeing the numbers tell you something isn't really useful, because then you have to actually take some action based on that information. And if there's no way within that context to be able to actually take that action, then it becomes the whole sort of feedback cycle and loop becomes disconnected, and you have multiple different activities and no concrete way to tie them all together and be able to actually complete that loop and have those feedback cycles. And I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of this space of operational analytics and its relation to that idea of actionable intelligence and not just business intelligence, and maybe some of the ways that you're able to actually use something like Census to push this data into these operational systems and have that feedback, that cycle into the business intelligence dashboards and the other sort of key performance indicators that the business is tracking.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't like to hit people over the head with, the kind of Gartner style feedback loop picture that you would draw here, but you're completely right. That is the goal, right? Is to improve your feedback loops. And that's the goal of arguably all business and most human endeavor, is to try to get better at it through iteration. And so how do you do that, right? You do that by like tightening the iteration time, right? Most products and companies that perform better is because their iteration time is shorter. So that way you can get a feedback loop quicker, right? This is why we even invented all these like A/B testing tools for websites. It's like to get the loop happening faster. And two is you got to, wire the entire thing together such that you can actually measure an objective function that you can improve, right? And so, I think the state of the art at most companies before we came around was work very hard to come up with KPIs, which is kind of like an objective function, that are not trivial to build, right? Because you have to clean the data correctly. You have to define the KPI precisely, right? And then the loop was maybe do a project and then come together in time, like let's say at the end of a week or at the end of a quarter, to observe the KPI and then determine, did what we do affect that or not? And was it causal or not? And then have a kind of like this human debate and then decide whether we should adjust direction or not, right? And in Census, I have seen this like firsthand. It has shifted a lot of these things because what you're doing is something more like, let's take one of our classic kind of scenarios that people use Census for, which is in these kind of high-scale software companies, they have tons of free users, right? Tons and tons of free users, like millions, if not tens of millions of free users. And you can't literally pick up the phone and call every single one, right? To say, hey, are you interested in our like enterprise feature? You can't do that. This is simply not scalable. And so you're going to create some kind of metric, right? For determining which users might be interesting to call. So that's a kind of query, right? That's a kind of KPI. It's actually often lots of variables come into play, right? It'll be things like how actively are they using features ABC? It'll be how big are they? It'll be how big is their company, right? All sorts of, there's things that are 100% bespoke to our customer, right? Not anything we could build a priori. And you'll then tell the sales team like, hey, these are the people to call, right? And then you'll hope that that works out. But with Census, what people do is they'll take that model, right, of out of our free users, who is attractive, who do we deem to be attractive, and automatically sync that, right, to their sales team. So that literally generates leads and work opportunities in kind of sales parlance. And so like, there's a list of people to start calling, right? It's just the salesperson can just go. They don't have to wonder even like why this user is at the top of their list. It'll tell them, right? It'll say they're active in this way. This is the champion at that company and so on and so forth. And so they'll just start making the calls. And because of course, you're re-ingesting all that CRM data and billing data back into the warehouse, you can track on a cohorted basis, on a time basis, how are we converting the leads that we generated. The data team can do all that and do that in an automated way. And so you can start to tweak, like realize that, you know what, our win rates are actually pretty bad, but if you slice it by employee count, it's really good above this number. So just tweak the KPI to say, okay, company's greater than this size. And now you've increased your win rate, you've reduced the busy work, and so on and so forth, right? Or vice versa. You could kind of expand the spigot if things are going really, really well. And all of that is happening with almost no human intervention, with no meeting required and no like strife between, the data team and the sales team. It's just, we can see what converts. And there's a lot more you could do here, right? Now, once you have all that wired, there's actually more that people could do than they are doing. And like, I've got tons of ideas for them to improve that even further, right? But that's the kind of feedback loop you want. And that's just one out of, dozens that people are able to achieve here. So when we first went out to market, if you go back to our old kind of materials from, almost like a year and a half, more than a year and a half ago, it was very much about this idea that we're the last mile in the data stack because it completes that feedback loop, right? It's like, you have data that perfectly ingests data from tools like Salesforce. And what we do is take the work that the data team does, which is massive and complex, and like pushes it back out. And now you have a loop now, right? I just don't like pitching a loop to end users because it's not what they're thinking about in the morning.
And so digging deeper into this concept of reverse ETL and operational analytics, you mentioned how you take issue with the term reverse ETL because of the fact that there is no implied directionality to it. But, historically, there has been one direction, as you mentioned, from your operational tools into your central data system so that you can then perform analysis and put it up on a pretty dashboard and job's done. I'm wondering if you can just talk through some of your thoughts on why sort of the past couple of years have been the time period where operational analytics and this whole category of tooling has kind of spontaneously sprung up from a number of different sources.
So when Census was born in 2018, we just provided this tool that connected to a warehouse and, pushed data out to Salesforce, et cetera. And our users kind of spontaneously refer to it as a reverse Fivetran, which I think is a very reasonable metaphor because it had the ease of use of Fivetran, right? And it did go in the opposite direction. So I think that's a very reasonable description. And then as the market grew, people started to use this like broader term, which is slightly less precise, but the core idea is still there. But really, like I said, reverse ETL is just like, it's the how, right? It's just like how bits move. I think the rise of operational analytics, which I'd like to think we helped catalyze, but was going to happen regardless, is that teams were trying to get more value out of their data. Like the early years of let's call it the modern data stack, was first and foremost just getting to the cloud, right? Step one, get to the cloud, which these transformations take time, right? Snowflake took a long time to become what this obvious thing that we now see today. But it was like, that's an overnight success in 10 years, right? And so I think that was the majority of what people were trying to solve for. And then getting to efficient BI I think we're still in the journey there, like in terms of having every company have really, really brilliant BI, both in terms of visualizations and the kind of organization of the data itself to be more useful to the broader set of people in the company. But I think once you've made those investments as a data team, you start thinking about how to have more leverage, right? And I think we came in at a really great time for a lot of companies where they had small data teams who had made kind of these amazing investments in cloud data infrastructure that give you a lot of capabilities that are not too hard to deploy and manage. And we gave them this tool that was also very easy to manage. That meant you didn't have to ask an engineer to kind of wire up data for you, and gave you dramatically more leverage. I'd like to think that in the arsenal of data tools, we might be one of the ones with the highest amount of like individual leverage, right? Where you take a single data analyst or an analytics engineer, whatever you want to call them today, and you give them this tool and they can suddenly impact the entire sales team, the entire marketing team, the entire support team. And this is what we saw happen at our customers. Like the clout of our users went dramatically up. They started being invited to meetings they were never in. They started to kind of turn off some of the homegrown systems that marketing teams had set up because they were wrong. But it made sense for them to exist because the marketing team was craving this information and didn't have the data team working with them. So they just did it on their own. And so I've seen data teams that we work with just first start to add a little bit into these destination tools and then slowly but surely just take over the entire pipeline, both making the company as a whole like systems cleaner because it's all going through one central clearinghouse that is the warehouse, and increases, like I said, the power of the data team. And that's been kind of really exciting to watch. But I'd say that's why you see the rise of operational analytics, because people have invested in great infrastructure and they want to get more out of it.
To your point of the, homegrown solutions often being wrong, I'm wondering if you can talk to some of the ways that, what are the other rising sort of nascent categories of data quality tooling is able to factor into this space of operational analytics and being able to validate the flows that are being pushed into these operational tools and be able to perform these quality checks in some of the ways that things like the investment in lineage tracking and being able to understand, what are the upstream and downstream impacts of these transformations, how that factors into the ways that Census and operational analytics is being applied in the organization.
First, let's not minimize this. The ways in which data is wrong in a company are myriad. And the first thing that I was pointing out was there are people dealing with data outside of the data team, and their errors are, plentiful and outside of the kind of, let's call it, control of the data team. The word data lineage doesn't exist in that side of the house. So I think the first step I've tried to help companies achieve, right, is to say your marketing team or your sales team is actually built little micro data stacks of their own. They just don't manage them well. And they make mistakes with their data that are less bugs and more straight up misunderstandings of the data. So they aggregate data differently than you do because they don't know what the correct aggregation is. It takes time and expertise to understand, let's call it, dates and like revenue over time. And it takes an accounting team getting angry at you to build the correct revenue KPI that you might not do as a quick and dirty solution when you're connecting like your Stripe to Salesforce directly or something. And so the first thing is by connecting the data stack out to the operational tools, you first benefit from bringing the data team's expertise and correctness about metrics out to those teams. So I think let's not underestimate that, because all those teams don't really know how to build KPIs at all correctly, and they'll approximate them. Whereas in the data team, at least semantically, is conscientious, I'll call it, about building these KPIs. So the first thing you still want to do is invest in a tool like ours to get that data out. But then something very interesting occurs, which is what you're pointing out, which is if the data team is going to be in the hot seat for providing information into these systems, then the impact of being wrong on a metric goes up. This is the whole beauty of leverage. It's a double-edged sword, right? You magnify every KPI's impact on the company. Therefore, if it's wrong, it's going to be much worse. And so I think as the data stack has evolved to be more central to a company's operations, we've seen not just tools like Census emerge to connect it to that world, but also data quality and testing and lineage tools emerge to help make sure that data teams don't screw up, right? To make sure that data doesn't become wrong. And, I think one of my friends over at one of those companies makes a good joke that if you've never provided bad data to someone, you haven't been in business long enough, right? You haven't been a data person long enough, which I think is very true. And so there's a lot to this, right? There's what kinds of errors are we trying to catch and what are the kinds of failures that occur? And so even here, I would differentiate between two categories of errors. There's errors in metrics themselves that a lot of the data observability tools are helping companies manage, which I think is awesome. So it might be due to the fact that your ingestion layer has failed to bring data in. It could be that your query became wrong because it didn't factor in certain nulls that started appearing in the data, right? There's a lot of ways in which your metrics can become incorrect, right? And that's what these observability tools solve for. And the lineage just helps you, in my mind, debug that, right? But then there's a whole other category of errors that I think tools like Census actually solve for, which may not be as obvious to people, but I think that is our job to be done here, which is there are a lot of ways in which your data quality goes down, but not because your query is wrong or the shape of the data has changed. It's that the wiring is not working correctly, right? Or there's implicit wiring at a company. And so this is what we often see that people replace, right? So you have your homegrown script that, does not, I'll give you a great example. A lot of destination systems, they're not like a warehouse. They actually have a lot of transient weird failure. They can reject data for a lot of reasons. They might reject you putting data into it because, a name field is too long, stuff like that, right? And they'll just reject the entire row of data. And you won't necessarily realize that. So you're starting to skew between your source of truth, which is the warehouse, and these destination systems. And that is something where a great tool like ours can make a big difference because that's what we just track end to end, right? We can signal to you that there's skew kind of being generated between your destinations and your source of truth, which is the warehouse. And that's kind of data quality in the day-to-day, in the wild, right? This is how you end up having bad data quality. It's not just that your KPIs have tests, whether that's DBT tests or using tools like, Monte Carlo and Big Eye, et cetera. It's because you're actually not getting every single data point to where it needs to go. And that's kind of what we want to make sure never happens, right? So we'd like it to be so that if your metric is correct and you have observability tools to make sure your metrics stay correct, that you can be assured that everything on the constellation, every satellite of the warehouse has that data. And if it doesn't, we will also kind of participate in what I'll call like the modern data stack kind of observability tooling, which is to alert you for when these things are starting to get out of sync.
Another interesting element of this whole sort of paradigm of closing the loop and this question of data quality is because of the fact that you're pushing data into these operational systems and then pulling it back out again to be able to do things like you said of closing the loop to see, how are our, categorizations of potential clients panning out in terms of how it actually performs and being able to close that iteration cycle. You also have the data quality in the ingestion layer where you're pulling data from those operational systems into your warehouse. How are you able to maybe link up those, in and out patterns of being able to actually reuse some of these data quality checks to ensure that the data you're pushing back into these systems adheres to the checks that you're trying to enforce on its way in?
Totally. I think your mind is exactly in the right place. I think people talk about data lineage for good reason. Most people think about it very zoomed in on inside the warehouse, right? Like you have an Airflow task that does this, and you have a dbt run that generates some more models, et cetera. And so you have lineage of how this occurs. But I think Census is actually really, really well suited to what I'll call like end-to-end lineage, which is what you're talking about, which is that a column changes and that gets ingested by Fivetran, and it ends up through a series of transformations feeding a field all the way back in your CRM, right? And we sit in such a place that like we can see the data arrive in the warehouse and watch it as part of a larger kind of transformation workflow and then push it back into the destination. So that's actually where it's most interesting to use Census, is to think about the lineage from an end-to-end perspective. So the way we think about this today is there are conventions to follow, and then there are, monitoring that we can provide, right? So there are two things that I tend to recommend to people. One is ensuring that you have kind of some level of delineation within your warehouse of kind of source data that is being pulled in from an ingestion tool, kind of somewhat staged transformations, and then some relatively clear set of, let's call it, data marts that you are providing out to arbitrary tools, right? And then we natively connect to dbt, right? So we can see the entire kind of model lifecycle within dbt. We can see the dependencies between them in the warehouse and can monitor kind of how tables are being populated. And so the way I think about this is like if you have a clean delineation, we can come in and tell you why something is skewing, right? Let's call it. Or suddenly things are no longer updating in a destination, or this field suddenly has a bunch of nulls, right? Or a bunch of duplicates. These are the things that people deal with all the time. So we tend to prevent those failures, and then you can kind of walk up the chain of transformations to understand why these things are happening. But to your question about how do I tighten the feedback loop between a metric in the CRM and another CRM that is feeding, that end to end, which I think is kind of what you're getting at. I'd say we don't do that very well yet, but it's definitely the kind of thing that we're always thinking about, which is, can we even build a straight up feedback loop on a metric? Could you put an optimization goal on a metric and, use the source metrics to feed it? Technologically, Census is able to do that. We just don't have the kind of like a UI for that today. But I think that's the right place to go. I like where you're thinking.
And so now digging more into the Census platform itself, can you talk through some of the ways that it's implemented and the overall sort of architecture and some of the implementation details of how you're able to build this system for being able to pull from the warehouse and push into these operational systems, and some of the challenges of building all of these integrations and how you're able to expose them in such a way as they are approachable and accessible to people throughout the organization and not just the very technical users in the data team?
So Census connects to warehouses in kind of the standard way you'd expect, right? You give it a role and access to the warehouse. You can scope as a data team, you can scope Census's access to a set of schemas. That way, you can have more users in the tool so that you can say, like, look, there's schemas that are just used by the low-level data team to, transform stuff. There's a lot of staging data in here. Like, we don't want people to kind of accidentally pull this into a destination system because it's really not production ready. And so you can scope in Census. You can say, I want to expose these things, right? These sets of schemas, these sets of views, tables, et cetera. And that way you can have a more of a self-service kind of experience for the somewhat SQL savvy, but like reasonable, users on the other end that just want to pull the data that they need and put in the tools that they're using. So that's kind of how you connect Census. And Census is a SaaS tool, so there's nothing to deploy on your side. And in fact, it stores one of the things we built from the first day of the product is that we don't store any of your data. All of the data that matters lives on your warehouse. And that's one of my favorite features of kind of modern cloud data warehouses is that we use them as a backing store for Census so that if you cut the cord, we have nothing from your company. And in a world of, this kind of secular push towards having more data ownership in companies and a lot of privacy infrastructure that's being developed at every company that we work with, like this is a really important kind of aspect of the tool. It's important and invisible, right? So it's like something I'd like to tell people. And then the way Census works, right, is you choose models, right? We natively connect to dbt, so you can like choose models out of your dbt project. You can write a query, you can just pick a view, and then you have this, what you see is what you get, kind of point and click ability to map that to all these destinations. The way we connect to those destinations using their API. So we have standard credentials into those tools. And we can read your destinations and pull in all of the unique features of your company. So believe it or not, like those destination products, whether that's Salesforce or Zendesk or you name it, people have customized them, right? They have added their fields, they've added their rules, and all of that we pull in and surface in our mapping UI so that you can determine how you want to map things, right? And the biggest feature here that, again, is under the covers is that the biggest, most important thing for Census is not just to get your data out into those tools. Because that is hard, don't get me wrong, because like these APIs are super complicated and fail in terrible ways. So just getting the data across is very, very hard. But you want to get the data out correctly, right? And so to your point about data quality, the core kind of feature here is that we want to make sure you're not pushing bad data. And that comes in two ways. One is we sit at the end of your transformation flow. So you can ensure that a sync in Census only occurs upon successful completion of like a dbt test, right? So that's like built into our capability. But beyond that, we have built-in understanding of every one of these tools to make sure you don't push data that is invalid by the marketing team's definition or the sales team's definition. So for example, it might be very reasonable for the data team for users to have a null value on pricing. Like you could have a pricing plan column and it's null, right? Like for the data team, that might be a very valid schema, right? But that might not be acceptable for someone who's using this data on the marketing team or on the sales team, and they need something else. They either need to cut those people out from the query or assign it a default value of something else. And that is what Census allows you to do and guarantee that you don't screw up, right? It's those kinds of last mile validations is what I'd say that Census takes care of. And then the rest is the kind of, let's call it ETL expectations that everyone should have, right? It's like, it always runs. It runs on a schedule. It can be triggered by workflow tools, our orchestration tools. We monitor everything, right? So we'll tell you when things break. We'll tell you when things partially break. So you have different levels of breakage in this world. And things can break for all sorts of reasons, right? Someone can delete the field that you're mapping in Salesforce and suddenly like the data can't be pushed anymore, right? We'll notify people for those things. You can notify in Slack and email, all these kinds of things you'd expect at this point. And the goal here is, Census is a bridge product, right? It's a bridge between the data team and the, let's call it marketing ops, sales ops, CS ops teams, all these kind of business operational teams. And so they'll get alerted too. And a lot of times it's their job to fix it, right? So take something as simple as you've taken a table of leads and you're syncing it into Salesforce opportunities, right? And a sales ops person changed some of the schemas in Salesforce, thus breaking the sync, right? And I'd love to be able to make Salesforce participate in the data lineage tooling that we've built, right? But we're not there yet. So what will happen is you'll change Salesforce and Census will alert you, right? You'll get, whenever the next kind of iteration of our syncs are, you'll get an email, you'll get an alert in your alerting tool, which whatever monitoring tool you use. And it'll say, hey, sync is broken because this field was deleted and you have to fix it. You can either delete the mapping, update the field, right? Whatever, resurrect the field, whatever needs to be done. And very much this is not just the responsibility of the data team. Otherwise, data teams would really not want to use Census. If everything related to breakage in every tool went to them, I think that would not be palatable. So very much the goal here is to say, when the marketing tool breaks a sync, the marketing ops team is notified and the data team, just in case that, they should be aware, right? But there's often a directionality of who should fix things when things are broken. And all of that is kind of built into the platform.
And as far as the sort of collaboration aspect, you mentioned that the sales team or the marketing team can say that, this value should never be null. This is the default that I want. What is their interface for being able to work with the data team to be able to set those rules and maintain them in Census?
So there's a couple things, and certain sales teams or marketing teams use products that can enforce that, which is nice. So the correct native way to do this is for them to go into, let's say, Salesforce, right? And you can set fields, right? Salesforce is really just a CRUD database UI. And so you can set fields to have these rules, right? You can say, this is a non-null field. And if you do that, then Census takes care of the rest. We detect that rule and prevent that sync from succeeding. And thus, you might not even be able to save the sync if you're trying to sync incorrectly, or you'll get alerted for all the rows that fail the test, right? So Census basically takes in all the knowledge that you've put in there and computes that, right? You could almost think of it as a compiler, right? It's taking what it knows about the destination, the source, every single row, and then determines which rows, fit the mold. And then you'll get alerted for the rows that don't. And again, you can have the sales team or sales ops team be alerted or the data team be alerted. So that's the most common way people do this, is push the logic into a tool that can implement that logic. And then if not, then you'd want to be able to build that rule as effectively a DBT test, which, some sales ops teams can't do that quite yet. So it kind of spans those two worlds. And then we're working on some things to make that a little more fun. That's what we're cooking up still.
Struggling with broken pipelines, stale dashboards, missing data? If this resonates with you, you're not alone. Data engineers struggling with unreliable data need look no further than Monte Carlo, the world's first end-to-end, fully automated data observability platform. In the same way that application performance monitoring ensures reliable software and keeps application downtime at bay, Monte Carlo solves the costly problem of broken data pipelines. Monte Carlo monitors and alerts for data issues across your data warehouses, data lakes, ETL, and business intelligence, reducing the time to detection and resolution from weeks or days to just minutes. Start trusting your data with Monte Carlo today. Visit dataengineeringpodcast.com/impact today to save your spot at Impact, the Data Observability Summit, a half-day virtual event featuring the first U.S. Chief Data Scientist, the founder of the Data Mesh, the creator of Apache Airflow, and more data pioneers spearheading some of the biggest movements in data. The first 50 people who RSVP will be entered to win an Oculus Quest 2. From the side of the data team, I'm wondering, what are some of the sort of common data modeling tasks that are useful or necessary to be able to effectively leverage something like Census, and some of the communications that they need to have with the sales and marketing teams to understand what is the context of the information that they're working with? What are the questions that we need to be able to answer as we're delivering the data into these different tools?
This is huge. I actually think this is a lot of the work to be done. I think over the next still a couple of years, I think that's where investments will pay off the most for data teams here. Because historically, right, and I don't mean ancient history, but relatively recent history, the primary goal of a data team, beyond moving to, a cloud data infrastructure, which is a means to an end, was to provide BI, right? And most KPIs in BI are aggregated at the whole kind of company level, right? So how much revenue did we make this quarter? Or by cohort, how much, revenue did we make? And what is our, net retention, et cetera, et cetera. But for operational analytics, you actually have to move away from overall aggregated data and into cohorted all the way down to the individual data. And that's the biggest change data teams need to make in their data models. That could be a significant shift, right? Because you might be, let's call it your unique company IDs or user IDs might be disappearing pretty quickly in your data transformations as you get to, taking all your invoice data and just aggregating it into how much money did we make. You might not care from which customer, right? And so that's probably where, there's real work to be done that cannot be, I can't do that work for you. I don't think we're yet at the point where, magic Census AI can cohort your data down to the individual. So that's where data teams spend their time to better work with Census, but more importantly, to better work with their sales and marketing teams, which is everything they do is at the individual, right? Individual could be a company or a user, right? So you have to think about that. What is a user? Is a user an email or is a user a database ID? But more importantly, is a user the same across 2 SKUs of your product? What if you have 3, modules in your product that people can independently sign up for? What is a user then, right? Do you treat it as one across all 3 or not? And the marketing team you want to work with on this, because you as a data team might invent 25 ways in which you do that. But the marketing team is telling you, I actually want to write an email that is not in triplicate, even though we have 3 products, when we announce this. But I'd also like to be able to email, people individually about that one product, or I want to be able to tell them about product C when they're using product A and B, which means you have to have a single user that spans all the products, which is real work, right? To deduplicate them, find a key that kind of covers all 3. This is where people usually fall back on email anyway, but that might not be correct. So that's the work to be done. And without that, the marketing team will not be able to access your data correctly. And then you're back to square one that we talked about, which is like the data is incorrect, right? Not because of, Census, the tool breaking, but because you're not aggregating at the right level for the use case. So that's super, super important. And I'd say most companies are still kind of early figuring in that out. A lot of our users that have been longtime Census users, we've got companies that have been using Census for 2-3 years. They are pretty good at this because out of necessity, right? But I think if all you've ever done is BI, this is going to be the area where you need to improve. Same thing for companies. What is a company? Is it a workspace in your app as a company? Is a company a collection of workspaces in your app? Does your app have workspaces? Is it tied to an email domain, et cetera, right? You have to figure these things out because without that, you don't have the right key for aggregating those KPIs. Because once you do, you can then say, okay, well, let's look at revenue by company. Let's look at usage by company. Let's look at most active user in company. And so that involves communication with the sales team, with the marketing team, with the support team, because that's who needs this fed correctly. And if you get this wrong for them, then they won't use your data at all because the KPIs will be wrong. And then you're back to square one. So yeah, you should get in the room. Now, what I recommend is don't try to boil the ocean, right? Start small, get in the room. A lot of marketing and sales teams might not think the data team is there to help them, but you can come in with a single KPI. And then from there, you have now a relationship, you're helping, and then you can start to listen, you can start to ask correct questions. And data teams are really good at, the 5 whys and kind of getting to the precision of what do you mean as a user? And a lot of times, let's call it marketing, sales, support teams don't know how to express it. They just kind of feel it. And so, data person kind of getting in the conversation there to figure out what exactly do you mean by a company? And then I will distill that into a set of SQL transformations is super important and super useful. And that's a lot more fun, I would say, as a task and much more leveraged than just waiting for them to email you about a broken dashboard and then trying to figure out what the bug is in the dashboard, right? It's a lot more interesting to think about these fundamental pieces off which all other KPIs can be kind of attached. Yeah, I think that's probably the largest work to be done. The rest is just creating good work, good kind of collaboration processes. Here, it's don't get exotic, use a bug tracker, if you can find tools that span the 2 teams, like something like Census, then great, right? Because then they can use it and they get alerted and you use it and you get alerted and it's everyone's happy. But Yeah, you should probably have some kind of bug tracker. You should have some kind of standing meeting. You should have maybe a wiki when you ship new KPIs. One of our customers is this company, Loom, that does videos, right? Their whole shtick is like async video. And their data team, whenever they ship a new KPI or a new table, depending, right? They will ship a video with it so that the team can learn what the heck this KPI is. And they find that a little video is like, it's like a little explainer video, and it's like super useful. So these are the ways you can improve your collaboration. And you have to figure out how to do this in a leveraged way, right? So it's like you don't want to have a meeting with every single person on the sales team to explain your latest, product usage KPI that's generating leads. Maybe a little wiki, maybe a little video. These are all the hacks that I think I've seen people use that are super impactful.
And to your point of releasing a new KPI or a new table, what is the workflow for a team that's using Census, and what are the opportunities for being able to do some sort of CI/CD workflow of being able to actually validate the changes that you're making before you go live with them?
Census is actually a CD tool, right? It is a deployment tool. What it is, it's just, again, given kind of the evolving change, like way in which the data world and the business world are learning things, like, you kind of don't lead with that right away. But that is what I think the job of Census is to take data, turn it into a product, right? Which is that you're deploying, which is well tested. And it is a product because the whole definition of product is in a way is that like, it's not a single use, right? It's not a single dashboard that you're making. It's potentially a single KPI that is touching 10 tools. So it's very important that you kind of validate, test it, and scale it out. So the way Census works is if you build a new KPI, we automatically ensure a few things, right? One is, you can think of syncs themselves in Census as entities that go through a kind of draft, stage, commit, kind of deploy set of states. You're able to edit mappings and see what would be the effect. Would this change the schema in Salesforce because you've now added a new field? Or is that just going to change the type definition? Like you can see all those things. And then, so you can kind of get a preview of the change that you will affect, right? Then there is the compatibility test, right? So we will prevent you from saving a sync, right? From deploying, committing a sync that has broken types. Like, so you're trying to map, a datetime into a Boolean, like that's not going to work, right? So those are all built in. And then you can think of those as like compile time checks, right? And then there is runtime checks. So let's say you add a new KPI, but you didn't realize that some of the time, like I said, it could be null, right? But we will prevent you from syncing those nulls, right? So like those rules are embedded in Census. And so at the end, you'll get like an alert that says, hey, 1 million rows, were synced, but out of those, like 55,000 like failed the null test. And so those were not sent over. And now it's, it's up to you to deal with that, right? To do with it as you will. Maybe that's important. You just cut them out. They were never meant to be part of the query, or you fix it, right?
In terms of your overall ideas and assumptions about what would be involved in actually building the Census product and what was needed in the operational analytics space, what are some of the assumptions that you had going into this business and going into this venture that have been challenged or changed as you started to iterate on the product and work with your customers and understand more of the nuance of what's actually involved in building this project?
I think when we first started out, the first thing that we had to tackle is that it was not expected in any way for the data team to be involved in this side of the house. That was a real kind of, I'll call it existential dilemma in the first year of Census. No one remembers these things, but in like 2019, it wasn't normal to have the data team in the mix. And the companies that used Census back then were very sophisticated, I'll call it. Like both sophisticated and not super big. So there was a lot of trust still in the company, right? Across teams and across the data team and the rest of the team. And how to scale that out at some level was something we had to learn. How do we teach other companies that this is okay? And not only is it okay, it's actually the right thing, right? So I think that was the first assumption that we had to kind of question, that we thought this was intuitive, but the customers didn't think this was intuitive, right? To say, like the warehouse could be in the mix here. So then there were two problems to that, right? One is marketing teams are going like, why would I work with my data team? Like I have my own thing. And then data teams intuitively, and again, it's hard to remember this, but it's like the idea of the warehouse as a source rather than a sink for data was bizarre in 2018, 2019. Just truly bizarre. They're like, that's not what a warehouse is for, which is true. Historically, that's not what a warehouse was for. But you had to see what, like the directions in which Snowflake was going, right? And BigQuery and everybody else to be able to be operational hubs, right? Was starting to become possible. But if you grew up in CS or in data, the warehouse was not meant to do this at first. And we've come a long way to making that possible. So those are a lot of things to overcome, was to say, hey, it's actually super cost effective and totally reasonable to treat the warehouse as an operational hub rather than just, a sink to analyze like billions of rows at the end of the quarter. And then finally, I would say there is a lot of misunderstanding and missed expectations around what people call real time. This was another thing we had to kind of tackle, which is like when you're first working with a marketing team or a marketing operations team, they're used to everything happening instantaneously and they get used to that. Because the original ways they've wired these tools is to be, kind of instantaneous. But they're often getting bad data because of that, right? Because they're not aggregating it correctly and they're not getting all the cleanup facilities that the data team has done. But then when you connect Census to your warehouse and out to a marketing tool, there's a delay now, right? It's not true real time, not capital R real time. And the good news is that's evolving, that's changing, that's improving. I think we're going to see the worlds of real time and warehouse, like batch, continue to kind of collide over the next few years, which is great. But in the early days, this was, again, an assumption we had to fight, right? Which is the data will be arriving slower, right? And that's not okay. And I had to kind of teach users, and we had to build facilities in Census, what I'll call like kind of fast and slow data. And so we created two kinds of pipelines because your entire warehouse and dbt workflow cannot be run in like sub-second kind of latencies. It's just not possible. And so I kind of taught users and both built features into Census that say, here's 80%, 90% of your data that comes in at the slow speed, which is still can be like sub-minute, but not sub-second. And then if you need sub-second, here's your alternate path. And the Census can participate in that so that you can make sure you're still getting some unification. But that was a lot of early kind of fights with users was kind of helping them understand. And again, some of this is technical, like we had to build things, and some of it was helping them understand their needs. So like, oh, you need real time. What do you mean by real time? And turns out like if you tell them, how about 60 seconds? Oh, that's perfectly fine. So you see, you might have spent like months trying to build real-time capability when all they needed was, a minute, which is marketing real-time. Do you know what I mean? And so that was a lot of the assumptions that we had to kind of debunk for ourselves in the early days.
Continuing on the question of real time and streaming and being able to push the data as it's being generated, I'm wondering what you see as the potential future for streaming architectures in the space of operational analytics and some of the technical and organizational barriers that constrain that from being something that we're realizing today.
Yeah, I think the fundamental constraint today is true real time and is on a separate stack altogether. And so if you want to have, remember we talked about this, like we said, like, hey, you need a unified definition of like, what is a user or what is a company, right? Those transformations ideally should not be duplicated because it's really hard to maintain. And some of those may even require, batch data to be able to determine, what those aggregations are. And so that's probably the fundamental limitation. It's like you can do real time, but it's like partially independent, right? There are bridges between the two you can create, but it's kind of independent. And so that's what people do in Census and in the market today. They kind of have like a fast path and a regular path. And then the goal is to try to keep this logic between them as simple and as separate as possible so that every time you make a fix, you don't have to go fix it in two places. I think over time, the best thing that can happen here is like for all the warehouses to continue to improve their real-time capability, right? Their streaming capability, whether that's through streaming materialized views with products like Materialize or just faster ingestion, like streaming ingestion of data on the warehouse, like all these things will get us closer. I think there's a speed of light problem, of course, right? So I think engineering teams may always rely on a different stack for kind of pub subsystems at high scale. But I think most of the rest of the business as the warehouses and some of these tools emerge that kind of bring streaming to those tools, to that stack, we'll probably get good enough to get, within a second or a few seconds. That should get us what we need.
In terms of your experience of working with your customers and seeing the applications of Census, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen it used?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's like you keep seeing new ways people use it. So one of the neatest things I've seen, so you can think of the first couple scenarios people do when they get started, right, is take 1 or 2 KPIs, like usage of your product. It's like a classic. The sales and marketing team always want to know exactly how people are using the product. And it might be that like some of the most basic KPIs, like how many times have they used the features, or how many times have they logged into the product? Like sometimes it's really basic KPIs like that, but it's a signal, right? And so you add that to a user or a company in all those tools, and then your teammates no longer have to open 2 tools to figure out what's going on, and they can kind of talk to the customer in a better way. So that's kind of like level 1. But what you see then people do once they have this kind of power in hand, they start to shift what I'll call logic that is very proprietary and imperative in tools like Salesforce, Marketo, et cetera. And they actually move the logic into SQL and in the warehouse, which is both more standard, more open of a language, right, than learning Apex, which is the programming language of Salesforce, and more functional rather than imperative, right? It's like, it's not do this and then do this and do that. Like they have these workflow builders and process builders in Salesforce that are very like imperative code in a way, even if they have UI. But SQL is kind of, in ways, aside from Excel, is maybe the world's most widely deployed functional language, right? And what I find our customers doing is taking hand-tuned processes that they wrote in Salesforce and moving them into the warehouse because they have their own playpen, right? Like there's the data team has their playpen of like, here's how you generate the people data mart, et cetera. And then you might have a sales ops person who's here and getting more technically savvy. And their job is to automate everything in the sales side, right? Like they have to do all these things. And they'll start to create really interesting business workflows in SQL. So it's not at all what you think of as what a data team would do, which is to build a KPI. What they're doing is saying, well, I want to do an assignment rule. And Salesforce gives you like convoluted ways to do this. And it's like hard to maintain, but it exists. But then they're like, wait, the inputs to that rule are already in the warehouse. And so why don't I just express that as a model, a transform, and just generate a new, column in the data. And then that's how they'll do assignment. There's one user I saw recently do this, and it's super neat, right? So they're doing work assignment on a salesperson in SQL. So they have all the sales team in SQL because it's all ingested, and they have all this all these KPIs and all these things. And based on that, basically they're taking a bunch of rows and saying, this is the sales owner, this is the sales owner, this is the sales owner. And they're doing that in SQL. It's super neat, right? It's more maintainable. If you fix it, it just works because it is going to recompute the table as a whole. So if you change your rules, it's like, you don't have to figure out, what do I need to rerun? It's like, there's no such thing in Census, right? It's like, if you change the state, if you change the table, we will synchronize. That's the whole point. So that's probably one of the most unusual, interesting things I've seen recently.
And in your experience of building the business and growing the product and helping to be one of the defining companies in this space of operational analytics, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
Ultimately, I think tools are about making people, more awesome versions of themselves, right? And so I think a lot of the interesting problems are in people and team design and company design. And so, going back to your first question, I think the ultimate way to draw the value of Census is that it creates a feedback loop, right? It's not just saying, here's put some KPIs in Salesforce. It's build a complete feedback loop from the action to the source data and back, right? And the hardest thing is helping data teams and executive teams understand that they should invest in this approach. And this is going to piss some people off, but I'd say the biggest problem that I've come across and that continues to be a huge, huge, huge pain and will be a pain for a while is that most data teams report to a CFO, or most business intelligence teams report to a CFO. Nothing against CFOs, but their job is kind of compliance and accounting and like getting the numbers right, and which is very important. And that's why the data teams have the best data. But it's not like a growth team, which is all about feedback loops and, increasing the velocity and scale of a company. And I think that's what data teams should be modeled after. They should be modeled after growth teams, and they should be bigger than them and more powerful than them and more valuable than them, because growth teams are hyper-focused on like product growth and like, A/B testing the website. And if you're Facebook, that's basically everything. At most companies, data teams have the broadest purview. If you can get the executive team to realize that this is an investment and this team should be one of your most valuable teams, then we've done our work. I think like that's actually a lot of ways the job I have as the company grows is to help companies realize this kind of shift. And it's non-trivial, right? It's like historically a data team was never in the hot seat, right? It was never in the critical path of business action. It was always let's reflect back on how things went last week or last month. I'm excluding data teams that are inside the engineering work, right? So, the data team at Uber was really building, petabyte Kafka streams and those I consider different, but that's a very small set of companies that operate that way. The broad set of companies in the world don't operate that way. And so my goal is just to try to figure out how to help them see the data team as foundational and as like almost like a platform rather than an end user.
And for people who are interested in exploring the space of operational analytics and being able to build those complete feedback cycles, what are the cases where Census is the wrong choice and they might be better suited either with one of the other off-the-shelf tools or building their own homegrown systems?
I think there's a magical time when you're relatively small as a company where, at least on the operations side, most of your data actually sits in one tool. And it's kind of a golden age, like if you can do that, right? Like there's a period of time when like you can almost say everything's in intercom. At my last startup, like there was a while there where there was no need for a warehouse. There was no need for those things. 95% of what we wanted to do was just in intercom, whether that's, messaging them or like all of our metrics were in there. It was really, really powerful. That obviously breaks down inevitably, right? Like either because your business becomes more complex or your scale, one of the two. And then so the first thing I would say is like, if your product is still simple enough that most of it can sit in a tool like that, then you should not focus on almost any aspect of quote unquote the modern data stack. You should focus on, getting users and improving activation, improving retention, et cetera. And then once you have that, of course, you're going to invest in the modern data stack, right? So when it comes to the build versus buy decisions there, I think it's becoming increasingly unlikely that people should build themselves, should write this code themselves. I think there's always scenarios, right? So if your tools are very bespoke, but even there, we support custom destinations in Census. And so like you could just use our framework to connect to your custom stuff, and then you'd still get all of our monitoring, all of our incrementality, all these things that you really want. So I think historically, like there were reasons to build this yourself, but I think they're diminishing. I mean, historically, another reason to build this yourself would have been, compliance and kind of security practices. But again, the way Census is designed, we don't store your data. We're SOC 2 and HIPAA compliant, all these things. The data is homed exactly where you want it to be. So it's like we're not even shifting what locales your data is stored in. So there's a lot of those reasons go away as well. I guess if you have on-prem, if you have a mix of cloud and on-prem, I would say maybe get off on-prem. But I think that's a reasonable situation in which you should probably do some of this yourself. But you should still be trying to build this feedback loop. I would say that like people should not wait to build those feedback loops by getting on the cloud first. But I have seen companies for whom it's faster to just say, screw it, let's move to the cloud and then we'll be able to use these off-the-shelf tools. But that's another good reason that you might want to build this yourself. Yeah. I mean, those are probably some of the reasons I would state for doing this. And then maybe you have extremely intense real-time requirements. And so for that, you need to put this into your kind of real-time infra, and Census doesn't fit into your real-time infra. Again, that means though that it's almost certainly the engineering team owns this rather than the broad data team. And that means you're also not dealing with a classical data warehouse. So you're already in a pretty different situation there. And again, I think a lot of companies get enamored with that and they don't realize the burden of managing that is actually very, very, very high. But that is another probably case where you might want to do it homegrown.
And as you continue to build out the product of Census, what are some of the things you have planned for the near to medium term?
So, the core goal of the company is to help, businesses do more with their data. Like today, like I said, we're trying to help these data teams who have made these investments in moving to the cloud, who have implemented great BI stacks, and get them to serve those insights directly to the business team, right? That's what we're trying to do today is just extract so much more value out of the work that data teams have been doing. And then I think there's a couple things that we want to work on next. One is enable more non-technical people to take action on that data, right? So you and I talked a bunch about this and how do we help those people kind of come in and participate in such a way that they're not just consuming the charts, but they're actually generating new insights themselves and pull the KPIs that they care about, all of which fits in the lineage of the whole data. And just ensuring that you never screw up, right? That you never push bad data and really focus on those kinds of things. And, beyond that, let's talk again next year.
Are there any other aspects of the overall space of operational analytics and the work that you're doing at Census that we didn't discuss that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think we covered most of it. I think the key idea here that I think we got across together is that operational analytics is, I don't even know if space is the right term. It's really a direction, an outcome for data teams, right? Is to say you are no longer just on the receiving end of all the, let's call it all the crap that comes down from management and from other teams. And you are now actually driving certain functional teams in the company. I have yet to meet a data team that isn't frustrated by the ratio of time that they're reactive to needs of their stakeholders versus proactive about building new, interesting functionality on the data team. And that's the goal here, is to say, let's move you from reactive further along the spectrum towards proactive and help you kind of impact the teams directly and then be, idea generators for those teams. And I think that's really the journey that we're on here with our customers, is how do we help make that happen?
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
I think the most exciting thing continues to be, like I said, reducing the latency in the warehouse stack. I think if latency stays high, there will always be two stacks. And so I would really like, Snowflake, Databricks, BigQuery, and all these folks to continue to invest in that as they understand that even though they're analytical databases, right, that were not originally intended to be used for low latency workflows, now that they can see the light that there's an opportunity for these warehouses to be hubs around the entire business, is just continuing to tighten the latency on those tools. And I think that would have a huge impact on the entire market.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you've been doing at Census and your perspective on the overall space of operational analytics and the potential benefits that it can have for organizations. It's definitely a very interesting space and one that I'm excited to see continue to grow and evolve. So thank you for all of the time and energy you've put into that and your work at Census, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, podcast.init, at pythonpodcast.com to learn about the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. If you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.